When Keanu Reeves pulled into a quiet gas station on a stormy night, a lone stray dog stood in the rain, staring at him. Not with fear, not with desperation, but with a silent recognition that sent a chill down his spine. He had never been here before. He had never seen this dog before. And yet, deep down, something told him this wasn't their first encounter. What started as a routine stop would soon unravel a mystery buried in time. A forgotten past, a bond that refused to be broken, and a truth waiting to be remembered. The rain hammered against the windshield as Keanu Reeves pulled into the dimly lit gas station, the neon glow of a flickering open sign casting eerie reflections across the wet pavement. He killed the engine, letting the sound of the storm take over. It was late, too late for anyone else to be out in weather like this. But as he reached for the door handle, he froze. Through the sheets of rain, standing motionless just beyond the station's overhang, was a dog. A large, black-furred creature, drenched and shivering, but standing firm. It wasn't seeking shelter. It wasn't whimpering or pacing. It just stood there watching him. Keanu's fingers tightened on the door handle. Something about the dog's stare made the air in his lungs feel heavier. This wasn't just some stray looking for food. There was something knowing in its icy blue eyes, something unsettlingly familiar. He stepped out of the car, boots splashing into a shallow puddle. The air was thick with the scent of wet asphalt and gasoline. The dog didn't move, didn't flinch, simply waited. Keanu took a cautious step forward. "Hey, buddy." His voice was low, steady, but there was an edge to it, like he was speaking to something more than just a lost dog. Still, the animal didn't react the way a stray should. It didn't cower, didn't retreat. Instead, it tilted its head ever so slightly, as if studying him. The gas station door creaked open, breaking the tension. A tired-looking attendant stepped out, tucking a cigarette behind his ear as he eyed Keanu. "That dog bothering you?" Keanu didn't answer right away. He glanced back at the animal, but it hadn't moved an inch. "Does it belong to someone around here?" The man scoffed. "That thing? Has been hanging around for years. Don't know where it came from. Won't let anyone near it. Just stands there, watching." Keanu frowned. "Waiting for what?" The man shrugged. "Beats me. Some folks say it used to have an owner. Some say it's cursed. Whatever it is, it don't belong to nobody." A sudden gust of wind howled through the lot, rattling the gas pumps. The dog's ears flicked, but its gaze never wavered. Keanu took another step closer, feeling a strange pull in his chest. Something deep, something unexplainable. The way the dog stood there, unwavering, felt like a question hanging in the air. A question Keanu wasn't sure he was ready to answer. The rain fell harder, soaking into Keanu's jacket as he watched the dog move away. Not running, not searching, but walking with purpose. There was nothing hesitant in its steps, nothing lost in the way it carried itself. It wasn't leaving, it was leading. Something inside him stirred, a feeling he couldn't quite place. It wasn't curiosity, it wasn't just concern. It was deeper than that. A pull, a whisper in his bones that told him this wasn't just a stray on a rainy night. He had no reason to follow, no logic behind the instinct, and yet, without a second thought, his feet moved. The gas station lights flickered behind him as he stepped into the darkness, his boots splashing against puddles. The storm howled through the empty streets, wind whipping against his coat, but the dog never hesitated, never looked back. It moved like it had done this before, like it had walked this path 100 times, like it knew exactly where it was going. Keanu didn't call out. He didn't try to catch up. He simply followed, his heartbeat steady but his mind racing. Why did this feel familiar? The air around him felt thick, almost electric, like he had stepped into a place where time bent in ways it shouldn't. The dog turned a corner, slipping through the narrow space between two old buildings. Keanu followed, instinct overriding reason. The alley was dark, barely touched by the glow of the street lamps, but ahead, through the veil of rain, he saw it, a house. It stood alone, its wooden frame aged and worn by time. The windows were dark, the front porch sagging slightly as if weighed down by something unseen. The dog stopped at the base of the steps, looking up at the door, then slowly turned its head to meet Keanu's gaze. And in that moment he knew. He had never been here before, and yet somehow he had. The storm raged on, rain drumming against the roof of the old house as Keanu stood at the base of the steps, staring at the warped wooden door. The dog remained still beside him, its wet fur glistening under the faint glow of a distant street lamp. It didn't scratch at the door. It didn't whine to be let in. It simply waited, as if knowing Keanu was the one who had to take the first step. A deep breath filled his lungs, and with an inexplicable sense of inevitability, he placed a hand against the door. The wood was damp and rough beneath his fingertips, but it didn't resist him. With a slow creak, the door swung inward, revealing a house frozen in time. The air inside was thick with dust, carrying the faint scent of old books and something faintly familiar, a trace of memory just out of reach. Moonlight filtered through the rain-streaked windows, casting long shadows across the worn wooden floor. The furniture was sparse, untouched, as though someone had left in a hurry but never returned. Keanu stepped inside, the floorboards creaking softly beneath his weight. The dog followed, silent and watchful, its gaze flickering between him and the darkened corners of the house. It knew this place. That much was clear. And somehow, deep down, Keanu felt like he did too. His eyes scanned the room, drawn to an old wooden cabinet near the fireplace. Something about it made his pulse quicken. He reached for the handle, pulling it open to reveal a small collection of books and a neatly stacked pile of papers yellowed with age. Among them, something stood out, a photograph. Keanu picked it up carefully, wiping the thin layer of dust away with his thumb. The image was faded, but the figures were unmistakable. A man stood at the center, his features eerily familiar. Not just familiar, identical. It was his face staring back at him, though the clothes and the setting belonged to another time, another life. His stomach tightened. This wasn't possible. It couldn't be. And yet, the proof was right there in his hands. He exhaled slowly, then turned his gaze downward to the dog. It was looking at him, those piercing blue eyes steady and unblinking. Waiting. And for the first time since the strange night had begun, Keanu felt something settle inside him, not fear, not doubt, but understanding. This wasn't just coincidence. This was a story he had lived before. And somehow it had found its way back to him. The storm raged on, rain drumming against the roof of the old house as Keanu stood at the base of the steps, staring at the warped wooden door. The dog remained still beside him, its wet fur glistening under the faint glow of a distant street lamp. It didn't scratch at the door. It didn't whine to be let in. It simply waited, as if knowing Keanu was the one who had to take the first step. A deep breath filled his lungs, and with an inexplicable sense of inevitability, he placed a hand against the door. The wood was damp and rough beneath his fingertips, but it didn't resist him. With a slow creak, the door swung inward, revealing a house frozen in time. The air inside was thick with dust, carrying the faint scent of old books and something faintly familiar, a trace of memory just out of reach. Moonlight filtered through the rain-streaked windows, casting long shadows across the worn wooden floor. The furniture was sparse, untouched, as though someone had left in a hurry but never returned. Keanu stepped inside, the floorboards creaking softly beneath his weight. The dog followed, silent and watchful, its gaze flickering between him and the darkened corners of the house. It knew this place. That much was clear. And somehow, deep down, Keanu felt like he did too. His eyes scanned the room, drawn to an old wooden cabinet near the fireplace. Something about it made his pulse quicken. He reached for the handle, pulling it open to reveal a small collection of books and a neatly stacked pile of papers yellowed with age. Among them, something stood out, a photograph. Keanu picked it up carefully, wiping the thin layer of dust away with his thumb. The image was faded, but the figures were unmistakable. A man stood at the center, his features eerily familiar. Not just familiar, identical. It was his face staring back at him, though the clothes and the setting belonged to another time, another life. His stomach tightened. This wasn't possible. It couldn't be. And yet, the proof was right there in his hands. He exhaled slowly, then turned his gaze downward to the dog. It was looking at him, those piercing blue eyes steady and unblinking. Waiting. And for the first time since the strange night had begun, Keanu felt something settle inside him, not fear, not doubt, but understanding. This wasn't just coincidence. This was a story he had lived before. And somehow it had found its way back to him. The room felt heavier now, as if the very walls were holding their breath. Keanu stood motionless, his eyes locked on the name written in delicate ink on the journal's first page. It wasn't his name, but it was. The leather cover of the book felt warm beneath his fingertips despite the cold air lingering in the room. He hesitated only for a second before flipping the page. The handwriting was fluid but firm, carrying the weight of someone who had written with purpose. If you are reading this, it means time has found its way back to itself. Keanu's heartbeat slowed. His fingers tightened around the edges of the pages as his eyes flickered across the words, each sentence sending another wave of unease through his chest. I do not know when you will return, only that you will. You always do. The dog let out a quiet breath beside him, its head tilting slightly as if urging him to continue. You have walked this path before and you will walk it again. But you have always left before the truth could reach you. You have always run. Do not run this time. Keanu exhaled sharply, a flicker of something *** recognition, maybe even guilt *** scraping against the edges of his mind. He turned another page, his pulse loud in his ears. The dog will guide you as he always has. He is not just yours. He is ours. He remembers even when you do not. Keanu's eyes snapped up to the dog, still sitting patiently beside him. His breath caught in his throat. The realization struck fast and deep. This wasn't the first time they had met. His fingers traced the ink on the page, his own mind grasping at fragments of something just beyond reach. A feeling. A moment in time that refused to be forgotten no matter how many lifetimes had passed. The journal's next entry was shorter, the handwriting sharper, more frantic. You must finish what you started. Keanu turned the page, but it was blank. Every page after that untouched. Whatever message had been meant for him had ended there. But the weight of its meaning pressed into his chest like a stone. He glanced back at the dog. No, not just a dog. Something more. Something older. It had found him again, just like the words in the journal had predicted. And now the only question that remained was, why? A sudden gust of wind rattled the window panes, the storm outside surging again as if trying to remind him that time wasn't waiting. Keanu closed the journal, his hands steady now. He had spent a lifetime searching for things he couldn't name. But this was something that had been searching for him. And this time he wouldn't run. The wind howled outside, rattling the old house as if trying to shake loose the memories buried within its walls. Keanu sat in the dim glow of the study, the leather-bound journal resting on his lap, its final words still lingering in his mind. You must finish what you started. The phrase repeated itself like an echo from another life, a whisper from a past he didn't remember but somehow knew had once been his. The dog remained beside him, its steady gaze unwavering, as if waiting for Keanu to understand what it already knew. Keanu exhaled slowly and stood, his movements deliberate as he closed the journal. His reflection in the dusty window caught his attention, a familiar face, but beneath the surface something felt altered. It was as if, in reading those words, he had stepped into a version of himself that had always existed, just beyond reach. He turned back toward the desk, scanning the scattered papers and books that had been left untouched for decades. There had to be something more. Something hidden. His hands moved instinctively, sliding open drawers, shifting papers, searching. Then he found it. A small brass key, aged but polished by time, nestled beneath a stack of yellowed letters. Keanu picked it up, its weight solid in his palm. The grooves were worn, as if it had been turned over in someone's hands 1,000 times before. The dog stood abruptly, ears pricking forward. Keanu followed its gaze toward the far side of the room, a cabinet, heavy and locked. He stepped toward it, fingers tightening around the key. The lock resisted for only a moment before clicking open with a soft metallic snap. The door swung outward, revealing a single wooden box inside, its lid engraved with a name. The same name that had been written in the journal. His heart pounded as he lifted the box, placing it on the desk before carefully lifting the lid. Inside, wrapped in faded linen, was a pocket watch. The gold surface was tarnished, the glass cracked, but when Keanu turned it over, his breath caught in his throat. There, etched into the metal, was an inscription. For when you find your way back. A chill passed through him, but not from fear. It was recognition. It was remembrance. His fingers brushed against the dial, and at his touch, the watch ticked for the first time in over a century. The dog let out a quiet breath, stepping closer. Keanu looked down at the watch, then back at the dog, realization sinking in. This had happened before. Not just in theory. Not just in fleeting déjà vu. He had been here before. He had stood in this very room. He had made a choice. And now time had circled back, offering him the chance to make it again. The storm outside began to calm, the howling wind fading into something softer. Keanu closed his fingers around the watch, its ticking steady in his palm. He didn't know where the next step would lead him. But this time he would take it. The ticking of the pocket watch filled the silent room, its rhythm steady, deliberate, as if it had been waiting for him all this time. Keanu turned it over in his palm, tracing the inscription once more. For when you find your way back. He exhaled, his breath slow and measured. The weight of the words pressed down on him, yet at the same time, something inside him felt lighter, as if a piece of himself had finally settled into place. The dog sat beside him, watching intently, its tail flicking slightly as if sensing the shift in the air. Keanu met its gaze, and for the first time he didn't just see a stray. He saw a companion. A guide. A piece of the same puzzle he had spent his life unknowingly trying to solve. Slowly he turned back to the journal, flipping through the remaining blank pages, half expecting something to appear. Nothing. No final clue. No hidden message. Just emptiness. But then he noticed it. A faint indentation on the last page, as if something had once been written there but had faded with time. He ran his fingers over the surface, feeling the shallow ridges left behind by the ink. And then, as if responding to his touch, the watch in his hand gave a sudden, sharp tick. The room shifted. Not physically, nothing moved, but the air changed, charged with something unseen yet deeply felt. The house, the walls, the very atmosphere around him felt less abandoned, less still. Keanu's breath hitched. It was almost as if the house had been waiting for him to reach this moment. He stood up, his movements slow, careful. The dog followed as he stepped out of the study back into the dimly lit hallway. The floor creaked beneath his feet, but this time it didn't sound like an old house groaning under time's weight. It sounded like footsteps, familiar ones. Keanu followed the faint pull in his chest, stopping in front of a door he hadn't opened before. Something about it felt final, like whatever lay beyond it would be the answer he hadn't realized he was searching for. His fingers hovered over the handle for just a moment before pushing it open. Inside, the room was simple. An old wooden bed. A small desk. A fireplace that hadn't burned in decades. And above the mantel, a mirror. Keanu stepped forward, his reflection clear in the glass. But something was wrong. His breath caught. The man staring back at him wasn't just his reflection. It was him, but not him. It was the man from the photograph. The same face. The same eyes. But dressed in another time, standing in this very room, looking back at him with the same quiet intensity. Keanu didn't move. Neither did the reflection. But as he stared, something shifted, not in the glass, but inside him. Memories. Not his own, but his, just the same. Flashes of another life. Another time. Laughter by the fire. The sound of paws on wooden floors. A voice, his voice, but not quite, whispering a promise. I'll find my way back. And then darkness. A sudden, violent ending. A loss that had echoed across time. Keanu's fingers tightened around the pocket watch, his pulse hammering in his ears. The reflection spoke, lips moving without sound. But Keanu didn't need to hear the words to understand. It was never about finding the past. It was about finishing what had been left undone. The dog let out a low, quiet breath, pressing against Keanu's leg as if grounding him in the moment. He exhaled slowly, closing his eyes for just a second, letting the weight of it all sink in. When he opened them again, the reflection was gone. Only himself, standing in the dim light, the storm outside finally beginning to ease. He turned to the dog, his voice steady now. Let's go. Without hesitation, the dog moved toward the door, leading him back into the world outside. The past had found him. The story had led him here. But it was up to him to decide what came next. As Keanu stepped onto the rain-slicked porch, the wind carried the distant chime of a clock tower in the distance. A familiar sound. One he had heard before. And this time he was ready to listen. Now that you've reached the end of the story, I want to hear from you. What did this journey make you feel? Did the mystery, the unbreakable bond, and the weight of the past resonate with you? Drop your thoughts in the comments, or, if you're short on time, drop a 2 if you loved the story, or a 7 if it didn't quite hit the mark. And if this story made you pause, made you think, or made you feel something you can't quite explain, share it with someone who would appreciate the mystery of fate and second chances. For more captivating, thought-provoking stories like this, subscribe to Tapestry of Worlds and hit the notification bell so you never miss the next journey into the unknown. Your support means everything. Let's keep weaving these stories together.